Hi and welcome to Maritha's History Corner's fourth video. Today I will talk about Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Katherine was born in Alcalá de Henares in Spain on the night on December 15th to 16 in 1485. She was the fifth and youngest child of the Catholic kings Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. A key component of the sovereign's strategies was the marital alliances that they made for their children. Catherine, as the fourth daughter, was of less political importance, and therefore her betrothal in 1489 to the son of Henry VII was in the nature of a gamble. Henry had only established himself as King of England from the Wars of the Roses in the year of Catherine's birth. And in 1489 it was still possible that the fledgling Tudor dynasty might be overthrown. Nevertheless, in a treaty of Medina del Campo in 1489, it was agreed that Catherine would marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, and travel to England when she was 14. Over the next 10 years, further negotiation took place, and the young couple were married by proxy. The Spanish princess left Spain in autumn 1501 and arrived at Plymouth on October 8th. Traveling slowly towards London, the party was met at Dogmersfield in Hampshire by Henry VII and Prince Arthur, who had been summoned from Ludlow, where he was presiding over the Council of Wales. Arthur turned 15 on September 20th. The couple, unable to converse in other than Latin, were briefly introduced before etiquette demanded that the bride would be kept away from the groom until the wedding day. Catherine was lodged in Lambeth Palace in London until the wedding was celebrated in St. Paul's Cathedral on December 14th. She was led to the altar by her groom's 10-year-old brother, Henry, the Duke of York. The marriage of the young couple were extremely popular in both court and country. The festivities to mark the occasion were lavish and continued jousting, feasting, and dancing. Arthur himself had either little taste or little energy for dancing, performing only once, whilst Henry, the Duke of York, showed himself as a boisterous performer. The young couple were put into bed in public, well aware that their primary duty was to produce sons to inherit the English throne. Not long after the marriage, it was decided that Arthur would return to his duties in the Marches of Wales, and there was some debate as to whether Catherine should accompany him. It was not uncommon for a young couple to consummate marriage and then be separated, as too much sexual activity at a young age was believed injurious to the health. Eventually, it was decided that Catherine would go. By March, Arthur was seriously ill, and he died on April 2nd, 1502. Catherine returned to London, and the debate started as for her future. Initially, Queen Isabella wanted her daughter to return home, but Henry VII was reluctant to see the vast jointure that Catherine would have been entitled to, of 1/3 of the revenues of the Principality of Wales and the Duchy of Cornwall sailing away, particularly since he had not yet received the whole of Catherine's dowry. A marriage was mooted for Catherine with the young Duke of York, some 5.5 years younger than she was. For such a marriage, a papal dispensation was needed, the type depending on whether or not the first marriage was consummated. Initially, there was doubt as to the status of Catherine's virginity, as Catherine's confessor and principal lady, Donna Elvira Manuel, have conflicting accounts. The Spanish sovereigns believed Donna Elvira, and wrote clearly that although Catherine was a virgin, they would request a dispensation covering the case of consummation, because they feared that at a later date the English king might wiggle out of the bargain. The initial dispensation gave consent for Catherine and Henry to marry, on the assumption that she had consummated her marriage to his brother, whilst an accompanying papal brief that appears only to have been dispatched to Spain enlarged on this with the insertion of the words "perhaps consummated." Despite the agreement, Henry VII dragged his feet, and Ferdinand and he continued to quarrel over Catherine's dowry. In 1504, Queen Isabella died, and the crowns of Spain broke apart as her daughter Juana, Duchess of Burgundy, inherited. Catherine's position became increasingly difficult when she did not have sufficient funds to maintain her household, without encroaching on plate and jewels that Henry VII claimed were part of her dowry. And she lived a miserable existence, sending increasingly emotional letters to her father requesting help, which Ferdinand largely ignored. The marriage between Catherine and Henry should have happened in 1505, when Henry was 14, the age of consent for a boy. The prince made a formal retraction of his betrothal, since it had been made during his minority. Nevertheless, negotiations for a marriage continued to take place. The Gordian knot was finally cut in 1509 when Henry VII died. Within few weeks of becoming king, the young Henry had married Catherine, and they were crowned together on June 24th, 1509. Over the next few years, Henry and Catherine appeared to live an almost idyllic life, as a happy young couple in the first flush of love and power. They danced and hummed vigorously, patronized musicians and scholars. The couple was also close politically, as Henry, seeking to establish himself as a new King Henry, allied with Ferdinand of Aragon to invade France. Before Henry led his army in France, he appointed Catherine as regent, a role she carried out extremely effectively, including working with the Earl of Surrey to repel the invasion of James IV of Scotland, who, as the ally of France, had invaded northern England. James was defeated at Flodden in one of England's most comprehensive victories against its northern neighbour, and Catherine identified herself closely with it. Unfortunately, matters did not go quite as well in France. Although Henry won territory, the first territory won by the English in France since 1453. It had little strategic value, and he was routinely let down by Ferdinand. Ferdinand's behavior undoubtedly weakened Catherine's political influence, which gradually began to be replaced by one of Henry's ministers, Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal and Archbishop of York. Wolsey was by nature against war. It was costly and wasteful. He looked for peace and political alliances, including with the French, whom Catherine had been brought up to see as the enemy. Catherine resented his influence, both personally and politically. Another problem was creeping into the royal marriage: the lack of children. Catherine became pregnant within weeks of her marriage, but miscarried a daughter in 1510. A son was born on January 1st, 1511, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, but he died within months. There were probably one or two more miscarriages before Catherine gave birth to the one child who would survive until adulthood, Mary, born February 18th, 1516. A final pregnancy in 1518 ended in a stillborn daughter. By 1525, Henry concluded there will be no more children. Although barely 40, Catherine seemed to have reached menopause and had not conceived in 7 years. For Henry, only second in his dynasty, to have a son was his paramount duty. Despite the example of a few women who had very successful regencies, the idea of a woman sovereign was unacceptable to the king. He had an illegitimate son in 1519 and inferred that he was capable of having healthy sons. And there must be another problem afflicting his marriage to Catherine. One event occurred that created the perfect storm for Catherine's marriage. Henry had fallen violently in love with one of Catherine's maid of honor, Anne Boleyn. Henry now sought to be released from the marriage to Catherine. It would be unfair to Henry to suggest that his concern about breaking God's law about marrying his brother's wife was completely cynical, only trumped up to rid himself of an unwanted spouse. He was a genuinely religious man, and is likely to have sought understanding in the Bible for his problems. Nevertheless, the spur of a love affair undoubtedly drove him on. Although we should not assume that he intended to marry Anne immediately. It was certainly not usual for popes to grant powerful kings ways out of undesirable marriages. And had circumstances in Europe been different, Clement VII might have looked favorable upon Henry's request. Unfortunately for Henry, the rising tide of Lutheranism challenging papal authority made the Pope less likely to rule that his predecessor had acted outside his power by granting the dispensation. This reluctance is compounded by the fact that Rome had been comprehensively sacked in 1527 by the troops of the Emperor Charles, who now dominated Italy. Charles was disinclined to see his aunt cast off and his cousin Mary disinherited. He may have declined to marry the child, but that did not mean that a cousin who was likely to be Queen of England was not a useful branch in his family tree. Clement agreed to a trial of the marriage in England, presided over by Cardinal Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio. The trial took place in Blackfriars in 1529, and Catherine's speech to Henry against all legal etiquette is one of the most famous in Tudor history. In it, she declared that her marriage was valid as her last marriage had not been consummated. She firmly denied that the loss of many children that she and Henry had been her fault. She repeated her faithful and loving service as his wife and finally declared that she would not accept any jurisdiction except the Pope himself. She then sailed majestically out of the court, refusing orders to return. No doubt, this king was uneasily aware of the cheer with which their beloved queen was greeted by the waiting crowds. Catherine and Henry's marriage limped along in public for another 2 years, in which time she would continue to be treated as queen. Eventually, in 1531, she was banished from court and forbidden to see either Henry or their daughter again. Over the next 2 years, Henry was determined to take matters into his own hands, and in January 1533 he married Anne Boleyn. In 1533, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, convened another court at Dunstable, at which he declared that Catherine's marriage had been invalid from the beginning. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy and Succession made it a criminal offence to refer to Catherine as queen. She was demoted to her previous rank, Princess Dowager of Wales. She continued to write to the Pope requesting him to confirm her marriage, and she refused to communicate in any way with anyone who did not address her as queen. She was moved further away from London, eventually to Kimbolton Castle, under the guardianship of Sir Edmund Bedingfield. In January 1536, when it became apparent that she was dying, Henry permitted a last visit from Eustace Chapois, the Emperor's ambassador. Whether this was an act of compassion or to show the Emperor that his aunt was not being ill-treated has been conjectured. He certainly would not permit their daughter Mary to visit her mother. After Chapois' departure, Maria de Dalinas, Lady Willoughby, that had come with Catherine to England 36 years before, lied her way in to see her former mistress, who died on January 7, 1536. Catherine was buried honorably in Peterborough Abbey, although her funeral was suitable for a Dowager Princess of Wales and not a queen. Catherine's monument, renewed in the 19th century, is still honored, and the arms of England and Spain were rehung in the 20th century, on the order of Queen Mary of Teck, wife of King George V. And now it's over to Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was born at some point during the first few years of the 16th century. Dates of 1501, 1503 and 1507 have been conjectured, though the earlier dates are more likely. She was probably born in Norfolk and baptized in the impressive church of Sal that her ancestor had patronized. Anne's parents were Sir Thomas Boleyn of Blicklingholt, Norfolk, and his wife, Lady Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the Earl of Surrey. Sir Thomas were noted for his mastery in French, a useful accomplishment, but it was also used as the language of European diplomacy. Armed with this skill, Sir Thomas undertook a number of embassies abroad, and was on good terms with Archduchess Marguerite of Austria, regent of the Low Countries. This friendship enabled him to put his daughter Anne in Marguerite's court in Michelin in 1512. Marguerite writes kindly about Anne's progress and describes her as so presentable and so pleasant, considering her youthful age, that I am more beholden to you for sending her to me than you to me. At some point, Anne transferred to the household of the Queen of France, Mary, Henry VIII's sister, and then her immediate successor, Claude De Valois. The French court under Francois I was the center of Renaissance learning and culture, and Anne thrived in this atmosphere. In 1521, Anne may have been reunited with her family, if only briefly, the Field of Cloth of Gold, if she attended as one of Queen Claude's train. In 1522, Anne returned to England and was found a place as maid of honor to Queen Katherine of Aragon. Anne's first recorded appearance was in March 1522, at a banquet held at York Place, the home of Henry VIII's minister, Cardinal Wolsey. The entertainment was for the benefit of the French ambassador, and Anne played the role of Perseverance amongst other ladies named after virtues, such as Beauty, played by Mary, the French queen, and Kindness, played by Anne's sister Mary. Anne was destined for a grand match. Her paternal grandmother, Margaret Butler, was a contender for the title of Lance of the Butler Earl of Ormond, and it was agreed with the king's support that Anne should marry James Butler, the son of the other contender, to settle the matter. For unknown reasons, the match never took place. Anne had a far more attractive match in mind. Lord Henry Percy, the son and heir of the Earl of Northumberland, and a member of the household of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, was her suitor. This would have been a splendid match for Anne, and it appears that the young couple was genuinely in love. The match was brutally broken off by the Cardinal and the Earl. At some point during 1525, Henry VIII fell victim to Anne's charm. She was not considered particularly beautiful according to the prevalent tastes, but had a sex appeal that drew male admiration. Initially, Henry hoped to make her his mistress, although he was starting to wonder about the validity to his marriage to Katherine of Aragon. It would do him a disservice to say that his attraction to Anne was his only motivating factor in his quest for an annulment. Anne, however, rejected Henry's overtures. It is possible that Anne, genuinely religious, rejected Henry for pure motives, and agreed to pursue the relationship only when he persuaded her that his first marriage was not valid. There can be no doubt that Henry had come to believe that his marriage to Catherine was flawed. Whatever her motivation, Anne refused to become his mistress, despite the outpouring of love that can still be read in the extant 17 love letters he sent her. The next 7 years were spent in increasing frustration, as Henry sought an annulment from Pope Clement VII, whose hands were tied by the fact that the emperor, who effectively controlled Rome, was Catherine's nephew. During these years, Anne were constantly by the king's side. If, as had been said, she made it her ambition to destroy Wolsey for breaking the match with Percy, then she succeeded. Wolsey was dismissed from his temporal offices and banished to his archdiocese of York. Anne was an evangelical, eager to see the Bible translated into English, and to see the flagrant abuses of the clergy remedied. Anne is credited to have shown Henry the book on the obedience of a Christian man, by the exiled heretic William Tyndale. In the book, Tyndale claims that God put the king on the top of the hierarchy and not the pope, and that subjects should be obedient in all things to the king. Unsurprisingly, Henry was thrilled by this. "This is a book for me and all the kings to read," he apparently said. Nevertheless, it was 4 more years until Henry broke with Rome and married Anne. Prior to the wedding, he raised her to nobility by giving her the title Lady Marquis of Pembroke. Armed with her new title, Anne and Henry went to Calais in October 1532 to meet the French king. Humiliatingly, Queen Eleanor and the Queen of Navarre refused to meet Anne. Francois, however, met her and danced with her. It is probably in Calais that Henry and Anne first slept together. By the new year, Anne was pregnant and the couple secretly married, probably on January 25th, 1533. The new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, presided over an ecclesiastical court in May of that year, and confirmed that the king's first marriage was null and the union with Anne was valid. She was prayed for as queen at Easter 1533, and June 1st she was crowned. At September 7th, 1533, Anne's first child was born, and to a huge disappointment for both parents, it was a girl, named Elizabeth. A boy would have vindicated Henry's annulment and his break with Rome. But to have turned the country upside down for another girl was a huge blow. Nevertheless, the couple put a brave face on the outcome and hoped a boy would follow. Although, in 1534, most of the nobles surrounding Henry and Anne were reconciled to an outward obedience. Anne's temperament, that had made her an ideal mistress, did not endear her to Henry as a wife, or to his friends and family as a suitable queen. Anne, with her temper, pride, and wit, was not fitting easily into the mold. Anne had laid down strict regulation for the seemingly conduct of her ladies. Her religious zeal for the reform of the church and support for evangelical thoughts were sincere, and her sharp intellect was matched with a sharp and often spiteful tongue, which alienated many and even irritated her former supporter, her uncle, the rather self-serving Duke of Norfolk. She should have taken more care to keep Norfolk sweet. They seem to have failed to understand that even Queen needs friends, and she would have benefited from some support to counterbalance the barely concealed contempt of the older ladies at court. Even her aunt, Norfolk's wives, refused to serve her, protesting her support for Catherine. The miscarriage in 1534 did not help the situation, and it was rumored that Henry had a new mistress. Nevertheless, after 8 years of being the woman Henry looked at, the appearance of a mistress must have been distressing for Queen Anne. 1535 was a difficult year. The executions of Sir Thomas More and Bishop Fisher shocked Europe, and Henry's daughter Mary continued to be defiant. The king and queen made an extended summer progress, included a trip to the delightful Sudley Castle. Perhaps being in holiday mood relaxed them, for by autumn Anne was pregnant again. In order to preserve her health, she remained in London while Henry and much of the court went on a hunting trip in September, during which he either renewed or started his acquaintanceship with Jane, daughter of Sir John Seymour of Woolfall, Wiltshire. Jane was brought to court as one of Anne's maids of honor. During the winter of 1535 and 1536, Henry paid her attention that deeply grieved his wife, and made the gender of her unborn child even more important. In January 1536, Anne miscarried. On April 24, 1536, Henry signed a commission, headed by Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, for investigation into some unspecified wrongdoing. Shortly after, 5 men, Mark Smeaton, a musician, Sir Henry Norris, groom of the stool and one of the king's closest friends, Sir William Brereton, Sir Francis Weston, and, appallingly, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Anne's brother, were all arrested. They were accused of adultery with the Queen and conspiring against the king. Smeaton confessed to adultery, perhaps with the aid of torture. The others protested their innocence strongly, but to no use. Anne herself was arrested May 2nd, and the commission read her charges before she was conveyed to the Tower of London. Whilst there, she was housed comfortably and surrounded by women such I have never loved, who reported every frightened, hysterical word she uttered. Anne's co-accused, except George Boleyn, were tried before her and found guilty, which of course meant that a guilty verdict against her was inevitable. It was inevitable from the start. Henry was determined to be rid of her. At the time, even Anne's enemies, at home and abroad, entertained doubts about her guilt. An opinion is divided on whether Henry really thought her guilty. If he did, he was acting very different from what he did later, when another wife was accused in a similar fashion. During Anne's imprisonment, he feasted and danced with Jane Seymour and seemed to not have a care in the world. Finally, on May 15, Anne, Queen of England, was tried in the Tower of London, and despite a very eloquent defense, she was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning or beheading. Her brother, too, was convicted. A swordsman from Saint Omer in France had already been sent for, in the anticipation of the verdict of Anne, and on May 19th she was executed, having sworn her innocence before taking the sacrament. Her remains are buried within the church of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower precinct. Well, that was all for this time. I really hope you enjoyed the video, so remember to subscribe. The next video will be out May 19th, and it will be about Anne of Cleves and Jane Seymour. So, see you then!